TouchLine. I'm your host, Anthony Totera, coming to you from the Soccer Hall of Fame here at the OSA Center. And I'm joined by Vijay Setlur, and he's with the Schulich School of Business of York University. Vijay, thanks for joining us here on TouchLine.
Thanks a lot for having me, Anthony. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Vijay, I've invited you here to talk about the sports world and business aspect of the game of soccer. Recently, we saw that Russia won the World Cup, which is coming up very shortly, and also Qatar. A lot of controversy with those two bids. I was really surprised, to be honest, about the bid with Qatar. But a lot of money was poured into their demonstration. We see that they're going to have air-conditioned stadiums. What are your thoughts on all that money that's going to be poured into those stadiums for only a few weeks?
Well, it's interesting because of the fact that Sepp Blatter, and it's become recently known that he actually didn't support the bid for Qatar. So that's an interesting aspect to the story. But the one thing that the FIFA Executive Committee actually liked about the bid is the legacy that this particular bid and eventually this World Cup would leave for the rest of the world, and that a lot of the stadiums would be makeshift stadiums that would be torn down and transported to other parts of the world, especially the developing world, where then they'll be erected again and used to serve underserviced areas in the sport. So it's that legacy aspect that the FIFA Executive Committee really liked about that bid.
Vijay, I'm a little bit concerned because of the weather at that time of the year. It's even late at night. It's high 30s, almost excruciating heat. How are the players going to be playing in that type of a condition? Also, recently I heard that they might change it to a World Cup, Winter World Cup. How is that going to affect the money for the European teams and clubs?
Well, you're definitely right about the heat being a factor, because in the middle of the summer in Qatar, in that area, you're talking about temperatures in the 40s, sometimes even the low 50s Celsius, which is almost unbearable. And we complain here when the temperature goes over 30. So imagine what it's like over 50. But a number of figures from Sepp Blatter to Michel Platini, the president of UEFA, have talked about moving the World Cup to the winter months. And right now in Qatar, you have the Asian Cup going on. And I was looking at a stat sheet or a score sheet from one of the matches, and the temperature in January for a game there right now is 17 degrees Celsius, which they actually consider to be cold, which for us is ideal temperature.
Yes.
So it shows that it can be done, but the key issue is scheduling, especially with the European leagues. A lot of those leagues are complaining about the fact that the scheduling is not going to work.
Vijay, let's talk about England losing out to Russia, the motherland of soccer, losing out. They're very upset. I don't blame them in one aspect, Vijay, because a lot of their fields and stadiums are beautiful. They're set. I love what England has done in the last number of years with the crowds and the violence they had many, many years ago. You hardly ever see that at all in England anymore. My heart goes out to the English fans, but I got to tell you, the Russian citizens and the Russian people deserve also, in my opinion, an opportunity to host a wonderful event like the World Cup there in the coming years. All the money is going to be poured into Russia for this event as well as the Olympics. Your thoughts?
Well, it's an interesting thing that's happening in that, just like in business, we have what's called the BRIC, the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China. Just like business and globalization is now sort of going in that direction of those four countries because of the potential of those markets and so on, it seems to be working the same way in soccer. You have soccer now moving into Southeast Asia, more so with a lot of clubs expanding their presence in Asia. You have now, obviously, Russia getting the World Cup. You've got interest in developing soccer in India, and obviously China has always been a big market for FIFA. So you have, just like regular international, multinational business going to these parts of the world to try to cultivate these markets, you have FIFA and soccer following suit. So it's not a surprise. The only question is can FIFA do it right?
Vijay, let me ask you a question. When you're teaching those classes to the young men and the young women, in the last number of years, let's say the last couple of years, the recession is hit. And if some of these young men or young women are going to hook on with some clubs, whether in soccer, in any other sport, they're going to have to try to attract sponsorship to those teams, those clubs, wherever they might be. How do you go about teaching that right now? Because the recession is been so devastating all over the world, and you can see that in soccer specifically, that there isn't much money out there at all.
Which is one of the reasons why many clubs have actually decided to venture into these markets, because of the fact that they have large population bases, and a lot of these markets have growing and affluent middle classes. So you have a ready-made market there for your particular product. So in the case of these teams, the idea is to go into these markets and try to cultivate this desire for, or this interest in European soccer, which seems to be there. One of the strange situations with Asia is that it's a large market with in a number of different countries, but these people who like soccer, they tend to like European soccer. They don't really follow their own domestic leagues. So I could see soccer in those areas developing to the point where there's interest in the European game, and it's up to these European clubs to take advantage of that, whether it be a Liverpool or an Arsenal expanding to China, building a Chinese website, playing games there, and so on. So the key is for these clubs to latch onto these Asian companies who want to expand their marketing presence.
Before we get to the Canadian aspect and soccer and money, Vijay, let's finish off by talking a little bit about this. A lot of people, when they talk about European soccer, you know that there's a ton of money thrown in there. But I think people also have to understand, in South America, as recently, just now in Brazil, Ronaldinho went back home to play there. And we see in China, in India, it's starting to change where there is money for players to go over there. We see that Fabio Cannavaro was finishing out his career, in Dubai. There's a lot of things that are happening in other countries that have money, except not always Europe that is the one that's dishing it out. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's all a testament to the fact that the game is growing around the world. And in the case of South America, some of those economies are emerging. Obviously, Brazil, I mentioned Argentina to an extent. And wherever the money grows, because of the fact that soccer is the #1 sport in many of these countries, the money by nature tends to get funneled into the most popular sport. Just like if we were talking about India, most of the money in sport goes into cricket. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. So as these continents and their economies grow, then it's just a matter of a natural progression from the money going into these particular sports.
Now, Vijay, let's talk about Canada. They're bidding for the Women's World Cup. I'm excited about this. I love Women's World Cup soccer. I really do, because the women leave it all out there. They give it 110% every time they're out there. They leave it all out there. I love Women's World Cup soccer. Can Canada realistically have a good shot at getting this World Cup for the women? And if so, there has to be money poured in by the CSA. And we know what the CSA is all about when it comes to pouring in money. They're tight. But they're going to have to do, because we need stadiums. We have a stadium in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. But what about Ottawa? What about Calgary? What about Edmonton? Should we not have them get a stadium and have this World Cup nationwide?
Well, the great thing about the Women's World Cup is the fact that Canada's already built a legacy of hosting major international, specifically FIFA tournaments, with the successful hosting of the 2002 FIFA Under-19 Women's World Championship, and then most recently Under-20 World Cup in 2007. So Canada has that track record of hosting these matches and these international events. Now, it's just a matter of coming up with a great bid to impress FIFA to say, look, the women's national team is on top of hosting these events and establishing this track record. The women's national team is rising up the rankings to the point now we're at their highest peak. They're at number 9. So when you combine the performance of the women's national team with the track record of hosting events, it puts Canada in a great position to really take a stranglehold of this particular bid. Now, the stadium situation is more of an internal matter, but there's a bit of a stadium renaissance happening in Canada, or that will happen actually in the next 2 to 3 years, so we could see some interesting venues come online.
So realistically, you think our chances here in Canada are quite good for landing this Women's World Cup bid? Or who would be the strongest nation that could be going up against us in this round of events? Who would that be?
Well, see, that's the interesting point, the fact that we don't know who the competition is. And usually you can gauge your status as a competitor, as a contender, based on who your competition is. But we don't even know right now who the competition is.
What are the whispers out there? Have you heard of any of the countries that are bidding?
I've heard anything from Chile to Peru.
Interesting.
And beyond that, it's been pretty hush-hush. It's not the same kind of process as with the Men's World Cup in that it's a very tight process that's done in a very short amount of time. And I think the decision will be coming sometime actually in March once the bids are submitted formally in February. So we're talking about a very, very tight time frame, and I'm surprised we don't know who the other contenders are, or who the other bidders are.
So am I. Vijay Setlur, just before we let you go, let the young man, the young woman out there know that if they want to go into sports marketing, sports as a career, and dealing with business, especially where you're coming from, York University, what do they need to do to get into that university of yours that's well known all over the world for that program?
Well, I'll say in terms of I'll separate getting into the school and getting into sports business. The 3 things you need in sports business are, number 1, you need to know how to network, because you can't get anywhere without the ability to build relationships and make contacts within the industry. Number 2, you need to have a passion for what you do. You need to have a passion for what you do. If you don't have a passion for this industry, it's very difficult to crack. And once you're in it, you have to really prove yourself. And if you don't have a passion to do it, it's not going to happen. And the third aspect is you need experience. If you don't have experience, it's very difficult to get into the industry, because Everything is about what have you done, how much have you sold, what have you accomplished, and so on. So you need that experience, but then it brings up the catch-22. Well, how are you going to get experience if no one gives you the opportunity? That's where the networking comes into play, and that's why I say that's one of the three factors. So networking, passion, and work experience. Now, to get into the Schulich School of Business, it's very competitive, and we have a great undergraduate student base. And in order to get into our school, you need to be at the top of your game when it comes to not only extracurricular activities, but also grades as well. So it's important to be well-rounded.
And this is a course that all over the world people are coming from, if I'm not mistaken, to learn and to grasp it.
Well, our undergraduate business program is one of the best in the country, if not the best, in terms of attracting quality students and the level of the curriculum and the teachers that we have on staff. So it's very competitive, and it's a very good program that stands up with many in North America.
Vijay Setlur, thanks for joining us here on Touchline. I've known you for a number of years. You carry a lot of the passion, a lot of the enthusiasm, and you're always out there networking with a lot of the young people to help them out. Keep it up, and thanks again for joining us here on Touchline.
Thanks, Anthony, for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks again for joining us here on Touchline.